The condensation had already started to warp the thick cardboard of the coaster, turning the edges soft and pliable against my thumb. In the low, amber light of the bar, the black ink of her handwriting looked heavy, almost urgent, cutting across the logo of the vineyard we both revered. I looked up at the empty stool, the leather still settling from her weight, but the front door was already swinging shut, cutting off the silhouette of her coat against the streetlights. Elena was gone. The sommelier, the woman who treated wine lists like sacred texts and bartenders like furniture, had left a message that would shatter the professional glass wall between us. I stood there, rag in hand, heart hammering against my ribs, realizing that the silence we'd maintained for 2 years had just been broken. The bar was closing, the lights were dimming, but my night was just beginning. Velvet and Vine wasn't just a bar. It was a cathedral to fermentation, a place of hushed tones and reverence for the grape. The air always smelled of polished mahogany, lemon zest, and the deep, earthy funk of expensive tannins breathing in decanters. This was my domain, the shadowed side of the counter where I existed as a pair of efficient hands and a silent nod. I was Jules, the quiet bartender who knew exactly how much ice to crack for a Negroni and exactly when to disappear into the background. I preferred it that way. Invisibility was safe. It allowed me to observe, to learn the cadence of the room, and, most dangerously, to watch her without being seen. I hid my attraction behind layers of professional detachment and the rhythmic, meditative motion of polishing stems until they gleamed like diamonds. Elena Vance was the sommelier, a title she wore like armor. She moved through the dining room with a terrifying precision, her heels clicking a rhythm that made the bussers straighten their spines and the patrons nervous about their pronunciations. She was beautiful, yes. Sharp cheekbones, dark hair pulled back in a severe knot that exposed the elegant line of her neck. But it was her focus that captivated me. She didn't just taste wine, she interrogated it. I had spent months memorizing the way her eyes narrowed when she found a flaw in a cork, the way her fingers lingered on the stem of a glass she approved of. To her, I was part of the machinery, essential but distinct, like the glass chiller or the espresso machine. Or so I thought. The night had been a blur of service, a chaotic symphony of clinking glasses and laughter. But by 11 p.m., the rhythm had slowed to a sultry crawl. The dining room was clearing out, leaving only the die-hard enthusiasts and the couples trying to prolong the evening. I was polishing a coupe glass, the linen towel moving in slow circles, when the atmosphere shifted. It wasn't a sound. It was a change in pressure. Elena had bypassed the service station and walked straight to the bar. She didn't sit immediately. She stood there, her hands resting on the cool marble, her gaze fixed on the rows of bottles behind me. The air between us coiled tight, charged with an electricity that made the hair on my arms stand up. She usually ignored the staff to focus entirely on the wine, treating the liquid as the only entity in the room worth her full attention. But tonight, the energy was directed at me. "The 96 Barolo," she said. Her voice was low, a velvety contrast to the crispness of her commands on the floor. It wasn't a request. It was an invitation to a ritual. I didn't ask if she wanted a taste. I didn't ask if she wanted to see the bottle. I simply turned, my movements deliberate, feeling her eyes tracking the line of my back. I retrieved the bottle, the label worn and dignified, and set it on the counter between us. The sound of the cork easing out was a soft sigh in the quiet room. I poured. The dark red liquid cascaded into the glass, releasing a bouquet of dried roses, tar, and truffle that seemed to fill the space between us. I slid the glass toward her. Our fingers didn't touch, but the proximity was suffocating in the best possible way. For a moment, she didn't move. She just stared at the wine, then lifted her gaze to mine. It was unflinching, dark and intense, stripping away the just the bartender facade I wore. She didn't say thank you. She didn't comment on the pour. She just held my eyes for 3 beats, long enough for my breath to hitch, long enough for the heat to rise in my chest. Then, she reached into her pocket, pulled out a pen, and scribbled something rapidly on the coaster beneath the glass. She stood up, the movement fluid and abrupt. "Keep the change," she whispered, though she hadn't paid a dime. And then she walked out, leaving the wine untouched, a single crimson offering to a mystery I was terrified to solve. I stared at the untouched Barolo for a long moment, the ruby liquid catching the low light, a silent accusation of waste. My hand trembled slightly as I reached out, not for the stem, but for the coaster. I slid it out from under the heavy base, the condensation cool against my fingertips. I didn't want to look. Looking made it real. Looking meant acknowledging that the tectonic plates of my safe, invisible world were shifting. But I flipped it over. The handwriting was jagged, darker than the ink should have been, as if she had pressed down with a force that threatened to tear the cardboard. It wasn't a complaint about the service. It wasn't a critique of the temperature. It was 2 sentences that stole the air right out of my lungs. "I've watched your hands for 2 years. The competence is lethal. Cellar, now." The heat didn't start in my face. It started in my stomach, a sudden, sharp drop in gravity that made me grip the mahogany counter for balance. Lethal. She had used the word lethal. For years, I had convinced myself that my efficiency was a cloak, a way to disappear into the mechanics of the bar. I thought I was a ghost to her, a useful spirit that kept the glasses filled and the inventory correct. But she hadn't been looking through me. She had been watching the specific, deliberate way I worked. She had been tracking the economy of my movement, the way I didn't waste a single gesture. The realization washed over me like a fever. The Ice Queen, the unreachable sommelier, had been burning with the same silent, frustrating current that I had been suppressing. I checked the clock on the POS system. 11:07 p.m. The dishwasher was already running the final cycle in the back, the rhythmic chug and hiss masking the sudden, erratic pounding of my heart. I left the glass where it was, a monument to the moment everything changed, and signaled to Marco, the barback, that I was stepping away for inventory. He nodded, barely looking up from the ice well, unaware that I was walking out of my life and into something entirely different. The transition from the front of the house to the back was a sensory assault. The warm, amber embrace of the dining room gave way to the harsh, fluorescent hum of the kitchen, the smell of degreaser and reduced stock. But I didn't stop there. I moved past the line, past the prep stations, to the heavy, insulated steel door at the far end of the corridor. The walk-in wine cellar. The vault. I pulled the handle. The seal broke with a heavy, sucking sound, and the air hit me instantly, 55 degrees and humid, carrying the scent of cork, French oak, and the dust of old vintages. It was a climate-controlled sanctuary, usually a place of solitude where I could escape the noise. Tonight, it felt like a cage. Elena was there. She was leaning against a rack of first-growth Bordeaux, her arms crossed over her chest, the posture defensive, but her eyes wide open, unblinking. In the harsh light of the cellar, stripped of the dining room's romance, she looked sharper, more dangerous. The silence stretched, heavy and thick, pressing against my eardrums. The hum of the cooling unit was the only sound, a low drone that underscored the tension. "You came," she said. Her voice was stripped of its professional polish, raw and immediate. "You ordered a drink you didn't touch," I replied. my own voice sounding foreign to my ears. Lower, rougher. I assumed you wanted something else. She pushed off the rack, closing the distance between us with 2 slow, deliberate steps. The space in the cellar was narrow, designed for bottles, not bodies. She stopped inches from me, close enough that I could smell the complexity of her perfume. Sandalwood, jasmine, and something sharp like ozone. I didn't want the wine, Jules, she murmured. I wanted to see if you were brave enough to follow the instruction. I'm here, I said, and the words felt like a surrender. Elena didn't smile. She reached out, her hands finding my waist. Her palms were cool, but the contact burned through the thin fabric of my black button-down. It wasn't a tentative touch. It was a claim. She gripped me firmly, her thumbs pressing into the curve of my hip bone, grounding me, pulling me slightly closer until the toes of our shoes touched. The air in the room was biting cold, raising gooseflesh on my arms, but the heat radiating from her was suffocating. I have spent 700 nights watching you work, she whispered, her gaze dropping to my mouth before snapping back up to my eyes. The way you handle the terrifying fragility of this place without shaking, it drives me insane. She leaned in, her face tilting, the movement sudden and sharp. I wanted her to close the gap. My breath hitched, a jagged intake of cold air, my body bracing for the impact. But she stopped a breath away, her lips hovering just millimeters from mine, the restraint vibrating between us like a plucked string. This isn't a game, she said, her voice a ghost against my skin. If we do this, the silence ends. The wall comes down. Are you ready for the noise? The heavy steel door of the cellar clicked shut, sealing the cold air and the confession behind us. We walked back into the kitchen separately, staggering our return by 30 seconds, a calculated gap to preserve the illusion. But the illusion was thinner now, translucent and fragile. Walking back onto the floor felt like stepping onto a stage where I'd suddenly forgotten my lines. The bar was still the bar, the polished wood, the gleam of the espresso machine, the low hum of conversation. But the geography of the room had shifted. Every point in space was now defined solely by its distance from her. The next few weeks, the geography of the room felt rewritten. We were professionals, efficient and sharp, but a new, vibrating frequency hummed under the surface. It was in the way she would slide a ticket onto the rail, her fingers lingering for a fraction of a second near my wrist. It was in the way she stood at the pass, her back to me, yet I could feel her awareness tracking my movement as I shook a cocktail, the ice rattling a frantic rhythm against the tin. The space between us wasn't empty anymore. It was charged, filled with the static of what we had almost done in the dark. I spent those shifts in a state of hyper-awareness, analyzing every interaction for a crack in her armor. Did she look at the sous chef that way? Did her voice drop that half octave when she spoke to the general manager? My internal monologue was a chaotic loop of validation and imposter syndrome. Why me? She was the sommelier, a woman who could blindly identify a vintage from a single sip, a woman who moved through high society with the ease of a predator. I was the bartender who learned wine by reading discarded labels in the recycling bin. I felt like a fraud, invited to a high-stakes table, waiting for the moment she realized I was bluffing. Then came the Tuesday training. The restaurant was dark, the chairs upturned on the tables like a forest of dead wood. Elena had asked me to stay behind to calibrate the new by-the-glass list. It was a professional request, on paper, but the air in the room told a different story. She set 3 glasses on the bar. Blind tasting. No labels, just the liquid and the truth. Tell me what you taste, she said, leaning her hip against the customer side of the bar. She was too close. The barrier of the wood felt negligible. I picked up the first glass, swirled it. The red legs dripped slowly down the crystal, thick and viscous. I lowered my nose to the rim, inhaling deeply, trying to focus on the wine and not the scent of her that seemed to be everywhere, clean, sharp, and intoxicating. It's bold, I started, my voice sounding too loud in the empty room. Dark fruit, black cherry, but there's something else, something tight, restrained. Structure, she corrected softly, watching my mouth. It's not restraint, Jules. It's structure. It's holding itself together under tension, like a bridge or a person. I took a sip. The tannin was aggressive, drawing my tongue, demanding attention. I swallowed, feeling the warmth travel down my throat. The finish is long, I said, meeting her eyes. It doesn't let go. Good, she whispered. And the body? Full, heavy. It takes up space. Elena reached across the bar, her hand covering mine on the stem of the glass. Her fingers were warm now. You have an instinct for the weight of things. Most people just taste the sugar or the alcohol. You taste the intent. She wasn't talking about the Cabernet anymore. The subtext was so loud, it was deafening. She moved her hand from the glass to my wrist, her thumb tracing the pulse point where my heart was trying to batter its way out of my skin. I don't need another expert, Jules, she said, her voice dropping to that dangerous, intimate register. I have plenty of experts. I need someone who feels the wine before they analyze it. Your palate is untainted. It's honest. That's what I crave. Honesty. I realized then that this wasn't a fling for her. She wasn't looking for a distraction. She was looking for a mirror. Someone who could reflect the raw, unpolished truth she spent her entire day refining away. It was strange how a simple change of wardrobe could dismantle a hierarchy. We met on a Thursday, my day off, at a small roastery on the edge of the city, neutral ground. I arrived 5 minutes early, clutching a paper cup, wearing my worn denim jacket and boots that had never seen the inside of the bar. I expected Elena to arrive in a blazer, perhaps a slightly more casual version of her armor. I wasn't prepared for the reality. She walked in wearing a soft, oversized gray sweater that swallowed her hands, and dark jeans that fit with a casual precision. But the real shock was her hair. The severe architectural bun was gone, replaced by loose, dark waves that framed her face and softened the sharp angles of her jaw. It was like seeing a statue step off its plinth and breathe. When she saw me, her smile wasn't the tight, professional acknowledgement she gave at the restaurant. It was slow, genuine, and reached her eyes. You look different, I said, the words clumsy. You look real, she countered, sliding into the booth opposite me. No apron, no script. We didn't stay at the coffee shop. The noise was too jagged, the fluorescent lights too bright for the fragile thing growing between us. She drove. Her car was exactly what I expected. Sleek, German, smelling of leather and something citrusy, like bergamot. It began to rain as we wound our way up the coastal road, a gray curtain that isolated us from the rest of the world. The rhythmic sweep of the wipers became the metronome for our conversation. We parked at a lookout point where the ocean was just a churning gray mass below us, invisible, but audible. The engine cut, and the silence that filled the car wasn't the heavy, loaded silence of the cellar. It was intimate. I'm tired, Jules, she said suddenly, staring out at the rain-streaked windshield. I'm tired of having to be perfect, of having to know the answer before the question is even asked. Everyone expects the sommelier to be this encyclopedia of taste, this unshakable authority. But sometimes I just want to drink cheap wine and not analyze the soil composition. I like the soil composition, I ventured softly. But I think I like this version better. She turned in her seat, the leather creaking softly. And you? You hide, Jules. You polish those glasses like you're trying to erase yourself. It's safer, I admitted, looking down at my hands. If I don't take up space, I can't be in the way. I can't be wrong. You're not wrong. Her voice dropped, that familiar, sultry register returning, but softer now. You're the only thing that feels right. She reached across the console. Her hand didn't go to my waist this time. It went to my hair, fingers tangling in the strands behind my ear. The sensation was electric, grounding. The scent of rain and her perfume filled the small space. My breath caught in my throat, a physical block that only she could remove. "Come here," she whispered. It wasn't a command. It was a plea. I leaned across the gearshift, the awkward mechanics of the car dissolving as the gravity between us took over. When her lips finally met mine, it wasn't an explosion. It was a slow, deliberate unraveling. Her mouth was soft, tasting of coffee and the mint she must have had earlier. It was a kiss that took its time, exploring the texture of the moment. I felt my guard drop, raw and immediate. There was no performance here, no audience, just the heat of her hand on my neck and the way she sighed into my mouth, a sound of pure relief. It was a sultry confirmation of everything the silence in the bar had promised. I deepened the kiss, my hand finding the soft wool of her sweater, pulling her closer until the console dug into my ribs, a pain I barely registered. For a minute, or maybe an hour, we just existed in that contact. The damp air, the fogged windows, the undeniable pull. When we finally pulled apart, flushed and breathless, the reality of it hit me. This was Elena, the Elena. And she was looking at me like I was the rarest vintage she had ever discovered. But as we drove back down the mountain in the darkening afternoon, a cold knot of anxiety began to form in my stomach. This was perfect. Too perfect. And in my experience, when things felt this good, the universe was usually just waiting for the right moment to shatter the glass. The gala descended on velvet and vine like a storm front, a high-pressure system of diamonds, tailored wool, and the cloying scent of 50 different designer perfumes warring for dominance. It was the Vintners Showcase, the biggest night of the year, where investors and critics gathered to decide the fate of our cellar's reputation. The bar, usually my sanctuary of controlled silence, had been transformed into a chaotic stage. The lights were brighter, the music was a frantic jazz tempo that grated against my nerves, and the air was so thick with body heat and expectation that it was hard to breathe. I was behind the stick, but I felt less like a bartender and more like a prop. The intimacy of the rain-streaked car and the quiet confession of the drive up the coast felt like a hallucination. In this room, surrounded by the city's elite, the hierarchy wasn't just restored, it was reinforced with steel beams. Elena was in her element, and it was terrifying to watch. She had shed the softness of the gray sweater and the loose waves. Tonight, she was encased in a structure of black silk, a gown that looked like it had been engineered rather than sewn. Her hair was back in that severe, punishing knot, pulling her features tight. She moved through the crowd not like a host, but like a grand master moving pieces on a board. She was charming, brilliant, and completely impenetrable. I watched her charm a notoriously difficult critic, her laugh sounding like wind chimes, perfectly tuned, but cold to the touch. The shift happened at 9:30 p.m. The bar was 3 deep with patrons, demanding complex cocktails that I was pouring with mechanical precision. Elena approached the bar, flanked by the critic and 2 major investors. They were the kind of men who took up space without asking, leaning their elbows on the wet mahogany, treating the workspace like their personal lounge. "This is the 82 Latour you promised?" one of the investors asked, his voice booming. "Decant it for 3 hours," Elena said smoothly. She reached over the bar, not looking at me, and snapped her fingers, a sharp, percussive sound. Glasses, 4, Bordeaux stems. The snap echoed in my chest. It wasn't a request. It wasn't the coded language we had developed over the last few weeks. It was a command, given to a servant. I froze for a fraction of a second, feeling the blood drain from my face, before my training kicked in. I set the 4 crystal stems on the counter, my movements stiff. "And who is this?" the critic asked, gesturing to me with a half-empty tumbler of scotch. "I've heard your cocktail program is adequate. Is this the mixologist?" I looked at Elena. This was the moment. This was the beat where she usually bridged the gap, where she would offer a nod of respect to my palate. I waited for her eyes to meet mine, for that secret communication. But she didn't look at me. She looked at the wine. "We focus on the wine here, Arthur," she said, her voice dismissive, breezy. "The bar is just support, essential plumbing. Jules will clear that water for you." Essential plumbing. The words landed like a physical blow. The air in the room seemed to vanish. I wasn't a partner. I wasn't the person she had kissed in the rain. I wasn't the untainted palate. I was plumbing. I was the invisible infrastructure that kept the shit moving so she could shine. The shame that washed over me was hot and acidic. It wasn't just that she had dismissed me. It was that I had believed, stupidly, that the rules had changed. I felt the familiar sting of erasure. But this time it was worse because I had tasted what it was like to be seen. I retreated into the mechanics. I didn't speak. I didn't make eye contact. I poured the water. I cleared the dirty napkins. I wiped the condensation from the wood where her elbows had rested. When the group moved away, laughing at some industry joke I wasn't privy to, I felt a crack in my chest that had nothing to do with the noise of the room. I couldn't be out there. I couldn't watch her perform this version of herself, the version that erased me to survive. I signaled Marco to take the main well, muttering something about a broken glass in the washer. I fled. The back of the house was a different kind of chaos, but it was honest. The dish pit was a wall of steam and noise. I threw myself into the rhythm of it, the heat of the industrial sprayer blasting against my hands, scalding and grounding. I loaded racks of dirty stems, the delicate crystal clicking together, threatening to shatter. I wanted them to shatter. I wanted to hear the sound of something breaking that matched the fracture inside me. I stood there, hidden in the steam, scrubbing lipstick stains off the rims of glasses, realizing that to Elena, I was perhaps just another stain she needed to wipe away when the lights were too bright. The lethal competence she admired in the dark was a liability in the light, and I wasn't sure I could survive being her secret much longer. The silence that followed the locking of the front door was heavier than the noise had been. It wasn't the peaceful, fermented silence of the cellar. It was the exhausted, debris-strewn silence of a battlefield. The air still held the ghost of expensive cologne and the sharp tang of spilled champagne. But the energy had drained out of the room, leaving only the wreckage. I was wiping down the bar top for the 3rd time, the rag moving in fierce, circular motions, trying to scrub away the memory of the last 4 hours, along with the sticky rings of Pinot Noir. I heard the click of her heels approach. Slower now, the militant rhythm gone. Elena stopped on the customer side of the bar. I didn't look up. I focused on a stubborn spot of wax near the taps, scratching at it with my fingernail until it flaked away. "That went well," she said. Her voice was thin, frayed at the edges. Arthur gave the list a glowing verbal. "The investors are happy." "I'm sure the plumbing is relieved to hear it," I said. The words came out quiet, but they cut through the dead air like a serrated knife. I finally looked up. Elena was leaning against a high-top table, her posture slumped. She had pulled the pins from her hair, letting the dark mass fall around her shoulders. But the softness I had seen in the car was gone. She looked pale, her lipstick worn off, her eyes dark with exhaustion. She flinched at my tone, her brow furrowing. "Jules," she started, straightening up. "Don't do that. You know how these people are. You know the game." "I know the game," I said, tossing the rag into the sanitizer bucket with a wet slap. "I just didn't realize I was the pawn you were willing to sacrifice to win it." "Essential plumbing? Is that what I am? Just the pipes that keep the shit flowing so you can look pristine? I was protecting you!" Her voice rose, cracking the stillness. She walked to the bar, gripping the edge, her knuckles white. "Arthur destroys people for sport. If I had introduced you as a collaborator, he would have torn you apart. He would have quizzed you on soil pH and fermentation temperatures until you humiliated yourself. I was keeping you out of the line of fire. I didn't ask for a shield, Elena." I walked around the end of the bar, closing the distance between us. The anger was a hot, tight coil in my chest, vibrating against my ribs. "I didn't ask you to hide me. You assumed I would fail. You assumed I couldn't handle him. That's not protection. That's shame." "It's not shame," she insisted, but her eyes wavered. "It's survival. This world, my world, it eats vulnerability. And you," she reached out, her hand hovering near my arm but not landing. "You are so open. You feel everything. I didn't want them to break that." "So you broke it yourself?" I stepped back, out of her reach. "You made me feel small, so they wouldn't. That logic is twisted, Elena. I don't need a savior. I pushed through this industry for 10 years without a pedigree. I have scars you've never even bothered to look at. I don't need you to stand in front of me. I need a partner who doesn't let go of my hand just because the lights come on." The silence stretched again, tight and painful. Elena looked at me, really looked at me, stripping away the panic and the exhaustion. She saw the hurt, but she also saw the resolve. She realized, perhaps for the first time, that the quiet bartender she admired wasn't fragile. I was tempered glass. I could take the heat. "I was terrified," she whispered, the admission falling from her lips like a stone. "I thought if I kept you in the dark, I could keep you safe. That if they didn't see you, they couldn't break what we have." "You can't protect me by erasing me," I said, my voice softening, the anger bleeding out to leave a raw, aching need. "The only thing that can break us is this silence. And you almost let it win." She moved then, crashing into me. It wasn't a graceful embrace. It was a collision. Her arms wrapped around my waist, tight, desperate, burying her face in the curve of my neck. I stood rigid for a heartbeat, holding on to my hurt. But the feel of her, the shaking of her shoulders, the heat of her body against mine, broke the dam. I wrapped my arms around her, pulling her in, my hands tangling in her loose hair. It wasn't a sexual touch. It was grounding. It was gravity. We stood there in the dim light of the empty bar, holding on to each other as if the floor were tilting. I breathed in the scent of her, fading perfume, stress, and the underlying, undeniable reality of her skin. "I'm sorry," she murmured against my neck, her breath warm and wet. "I won't let go again. I promise." "Don't promise," I whispered, resting my chin on her head. "Just see me. All of me. Even when it's inconvenient." "I see you," she said, pulling back just enough to look me in the eyes. Her gaze was unflinching, watery, but clear. "I see you, Jules, and I'm done hiding the best part of this place." The real shift happened on a Wednesday afternoon during the pre-shift briefing. The staff was gathered, notebooks out, expecting the usual lecture on ticket times or uniform standards. Elena stood at the head of the room, holding the heavy, leather-bound master list, the Bible of the restaurant. "The current reserve list is stagnant," she announced, her voice cool and authoritative. She didn't look at the floor. She looked at me. It lacks perspective. I'm scrapping the spring update. Jules and I will be co-curating the new selection. If you have questions about the new pours, ask her. Her palette is the only one I trust to check my own. The room went dead silent. Marco dropped his pen. To the uninitiated, it was a simple delegation of duty. To us, and to anyone paying attention, it was a coronation. She wasn't just letting me into the cellar. She was putting my name on the door. She was validating my instincts in the only language that mattered to her: wine. The process of creation that followed was intimate in a way that touching never could be. We spent nights locked in the restaurant, long after the last customer had stumbled out. The lights were dimmed to a single bank over the bar, transforming the space into a cave of shadows and glass. The counter became a battlefield of open bottles, corks, and scribbled tasting notes. We didn't just taste, we argued. We debated the merits of a high-acid Chenin Blanc versus a rounder, oak-aged Chardonnay with the ferocity of lovers fighting for ground. It's too aggressive, I argued one night, pushing a glass of Nebbiolo away. It attacks the palate. There's no seduction. It's not aggressive, Jules. It's assertive, Elena countered, sliding the glass back to me. Her eyes were dark, reflecting the red liquid. It demands you pay attention. It doesn't beg for your approval. It waits for you to rise to its level. Try it again. I did. I took a sip, letting the tannins coat my tongue, drying out the moisture, leaving behind the taste of dried cherries and leather. I looked at her over the rim. It's difficult, I admitted. It makes you work for it. Exactly, she whispered, leaning across the marble, her face inches from mine. The best things always do. The line between the wine and us blurred until it vanished. We described flavors as emotions, textures as memories. A Riesling was nervous energy. A Syrah was possessive. A vintage champagne was the feeling of finally exhaling. We were mapping our own history through the grapes, decoding each other, one sip at a time. But the moment that sealed it wasn't over a $1,000 bottle. It was at 2 a.m. on a Friday. We were exhausted, our teeth stained purple, the adrenaline of the week finally crashing. We sat on the rubber floor mats behind the bar, legs tangled together, eating greasy pad thai from white cardboard cartons. The glamour of the sommelier was stripped away. Elena was wearing one of my spare flannel shirts over her dress, eating a dumpling with chopsticks, laughing at something I'd said with her mouth full. "This is better," she said, gesturing with a chopstick between the takeout box and the wall of expensive liquor behind us. "The pad thai?" I teased, leaning my head back against the dishwasher. "No," she said, her expression softening. "This, being real. I spent so long curating everything, the wine, the image, the distance. I forgot that the best part of the meal is usually the mess you make while eating it." She reached out, wiping a smudge of sauce from my lip with her thumb, her touch lingering, warm and grounding. "You make the mess worth it, Jules." I looked at her, disheveled, brilliant, and entirely mine, and realized that the coaster she'd left that first night hadn't just been an invitation to the cellar. It had been an invitation to this. The messy, complex, beautiful reality of the ground floor. The launch of the Grand Reserve collection felt less like a menu update and more like a second act. The air in the bar was thick, perfumed with the scent of anticipation and expensive cologne. The critics had returned, a school of sharks in tailored suits, circling the water to see if the sommelier had lost her edge. Arthur was there, of course, occupying the center table like a monarch, his pen hovering over his notebook with the threat of a guillotine blade. A month ago, his presence would have reduced me to the invisible mechanics of the bar, a pair of hands shaking cocktails in the periphery. Tonight, I stood at the pass, my shoulders back, feeling the weight of the room not as a burden, but as a stage we had built together. Elena moved through the crowd, but the frantic, brittle energy of the gala was gone. She was fluid, grounded. She wore a deep velvet suit that caught the light, softening her edges while commanding absolute attention. She stopped at Arthur's table, pouring a splash of the 2005 Syrah we had debated over until 3 in the morning. "It's a departure for you, Elena," Arthur noted, swirling the glass without tasting it. "It's chaotic, unrestrained. I barely recognize your signature." The room went quiet. This was the test. The old Elena would have defended the choice with technical jargon, citing weather patterns and harvest yields to intellectualize the chaos. The new Elena just smiled, a slow, dangerous curve of her lips. "It's not my signature, Arthur," she said, her voice carrying clearly over the low hum of jazz. She turned, her eyes finding mine across the room. It wasn't a panic signal. It was a spotlight. It's a collaboration. I've spent years curating perfection, but I've learned recently that perfection is sterile. This list isn't about control. It's about instinct. And for that, you need to thank Jules. She gestured to me. The heads turned. The investors, the critics, the regulars, they all looked at the bar. But this time, I didn't shrink. I didn't wipe a non-existent spot on the counter. I walked out from behind the wood, carrying the bottle, and approached the table. "The chaos is the point," I said, my voice steady, grounded by the weeks of late-night arguments and shared truths. "It's a vintage that struggled. It fought the frost. It fought the heat. And it survived. It doesn't taste like a controlled environment, Arthur. It tastes like resilience. It has a finish that refuses to apologize for taking up space." Arthur stared at me, then at the wine. He took a sip. The silence stretched, tight and coiled, until he set the glass down. "Resilience," he murmured, tasting the word. "I suppose it does." He nodded at Elena. "A blessing." The tension in the room broke, replaced by the murmur of approval. Elena didn't look at Arthur, though. She was still looking at me, her expression raw with pride. A look that stripped me bare, right there in the middle of the dining room. Later, as the service wound down and the adrenaline began to mellow into a warm, golden fatigue, Elena sat at the bar. It was a mirror of that first night. The lights were dimming, the door was locked. She looked tired, but victorious, the velvet jacket unbuttoned. I walked over, not as a subordinate, but as her equal. I placed a glass of water in front of her. And then, with a sleight of hand I had practiced all night, I slid a coaster under it. She froze. She looked up at me, her eyes wide, questioning. "Read it," I whispered. She lifted the glass. The water rippled. She flipped the cardboard. I hadn't used a pen this time. I had used a marker, the ink bold and permanent. "I'm not afraid of the noise anymore. The partnership is absolute. My place, forever." Elena looked up, her eyes bright with sudden tears she refused to shed. She reached across the bar, threading her fingers through mine, her grip tight, possessive, and undeniably real. The event was over, the critics were gone, and the wine list was a success. But as her thumb brushed over my knuckles, grounding me in the dim light, I knew the real prize wasn't the review. It was the hand holding mine under the table, and the promise that we would never go back to the silence. It had been exactly 365 days since the first coaster, and the bar smelled different. The notes of mahogany and lemon zest were still there, eternal and grounding, but the scent of my own fear had evaporated, replaced by the deep, resonant aroma of belonging. I wasn't just the hands polishing the glass anymore. I was the curator. The Grand Reserve list was a city staple, but the real legacy was the quiet revolution that had taken place behind the pass. I stood at the service well, watching Elena across the room as the last guests filtered out into the rain. She was speaking to a new hire, her posture relaxed, the severe tension of her shoulders replaced by a fluid grace. She wasn't the Ice Queen anymore. She was still sharp, still brilliant, but the armor had been smelted down into something warmer, something that allowed the light to get in. She caught me watching. A year ago, I would have looked away, terrified of staring at the sun. Now, I held her gaze. I let my eyes trace the line of her jaw, the curve of her neck, sending a silent, heavy signal across the room. Mine. The crowd thinned until the room was finally ours. The ritual of closing was the same, the locking of the heavy front door, the gradual dimming of the track lights, but the silence wasn't empty. It was full. She walked behind the bar, entering the space that used to be my fortress of solitude, and it felt natural. She didn't ask for a drink. She simply leaned against the stainless steel sink, watching me wipe down the mats, her eyes dark and attentive. "You're thinking too loud," she murmured, the corners of her mouth twitching with a secret amusement. "I'm thinking about the difference between invisible and discreet," I said, tossing the towel into the bin. "I used to think they were the same. I thought if I disappeared, I was doing a good job, that silence was safety." Elena moved closer, her hips bumping mine, the contact electric, even through the denim. "And now?" "Now I know that disappearing is a waste of good material." She laughed, a low sound that vibrated in her chest and settled in mine. She reached out, her fingers tracing the collar of my shirt, a touch that was possessive and tender. "You were never hidden, Jules. You were just waiting to be decanted. You needed air. You needed to breathe." I turned to face her fully. The distance was zero. I reached out, my hands finding her waist, familiar now, mapped and memorized. This wasn't the frantic, cold room desperation of the beginning. This was the deep, complex finish of a vintage that had weathered the frost. It was comfortable, but the heat was still there, coiled and waiting under the surface. "It wasn't about you saving me," I whispered, leaning in until our foreheads touched, breathing in the scent of her skin, bergamot and ozone. It was about realizing I was worth being tasted, savored, she corrected softly, her breath hitching as my thumb brushed her lower lip. "You are meant to be savored, slowly, without distraction." The kiss was a deliberate exploration of everything we had built. It was sultry and unhurried, tasting of the shift from fear to certainty, from silence to a shared language. Her hands tangled in my hair, pulling me closer, anchoring me to the earth. I felt the tension of the day dissolve into the warmth of her body against mine. There was no imposter syndrome left, no fear of the lights coming on or the critics watching. The most intoxicating thing wasn't the rare vintage on the shelf or the status of the room. It was the simple, terrifying permission to be fully myself in her arms. The sommelier hadn't just ordered a glass of wine that night. She had ordered a life I finally felt brave enough to serve. The coaster was long gone, recycled into pulp, but the message was written into the architecture of my bones. The lights finally clicked off, leaving us backlit by the street lamps outside. Two silhouettes merged against the rows of glimmering bottles. The glass on the counter was empty, but the space between us was finally full. If this blend of tension and tenderness resonated with you, subscribe to follow the rest of the legacy. Let me know in the comments if you've ever found a love that required you to be brave. The door clicked shut behind us.